Hello, church. In this week's video, I'd like to share some thoughts on the story of the road to Emmaus, which I'll read to you now from Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. He said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" So he asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who is a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. And besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things, and then enter into his glory?" And then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" In that same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This whole story hinges on this big reveal that Jesus was the stranger, and it was only in the breaking of the bread that these two disciples recognized him for who he was. It's a classic plot twist that we've been inundated with over the years. From the Odyssey to the Count of Monte Cristo, and even in Star Wars, Cinderella, or Superman, we seem to really love stories with a hidden character that no one can recognize, even though they should. We love being in on the secret, and knowing that secret seems so obvious to us, and we always wonder, how did everyone else not know? But if we were honest with ourselves, we would likely never recognize the Superman in the cubicle next to us, or the long-lost relative we thought was gone, or Jesus on the road. And that's okay. It's okay that we need reminders and symbols, rituals and memory devices to recognize the truth that has been under our noses this whole time. This is one of the reasons why what we do in corporate worship is so important. When we gather together to sing gospel truth and to say gospel stories, to kneel in prayer, listen to a sermon, watch a baptism, to take bread and break it, we are reminding ourselves of the identity of Jesus that has been right there in front of us all this time. But in between the reminders, we forget. We become distracted by our worries and our stress. We exhaust ourselves in our to-do lists. And we lose sight of God in the midst of our own lives. And somewhere, an outsider or audience member watching the play of our lives scoffs at how we could miss that God has been in every part of our lives this whole time, and we just didn't see it. Yet somehow we do. We fail to have the eyes that see God around us. We fail to have the ears that hear God's voice through the bombarding noises of our busy lives. So we go to worship to focus our senses and to remember who God is. Finally, seeing him in the breaking of the bread. But what do we do in quarantine when we cannot go and focus ourselves in worship? How will we see and hear and taste and feel God in our midst without all the reminders of our rituals? Certainly the Zoom virtual worship that we are offering can help us preserve some of these rituals that we know and love. But I think that we could also retrain our senses to adapt to our isolation so that we can see God around us. Much like the two on the road to Emmaus learned to see Jesus in the breaking of the bread. For me personally, that looks like gardening. In the past few weeks, I have planted 8 rose bushes, over a dozen strawberry plants, some heirloom tomatoes, and a bunch of flowers. I spend time every day with these plants, whether that's just watering or checking on their growth. And as I do, I'm reminded of a strange assortment of things. I think of Jesus explaining how he is the vine and we are the branches, and how just as my plants are sprouting new leaves from the nourishment of their stems and roots, so too I can grow and flourish from the nourishment of Christ. I think of Jonah and the shade tree that God provided and then took away. I wonder when my strawberries and tomatoes will produce fruit, and I wonder if God looks at me with the same giddy expectation. There's so much in my garden that stimulates my senses in a theological way, helping me to see, hear, and remember God. And my gardening will never replace the rituals and practices of worship on a Sunday morning. But in these unique circumstances, gardening does remind me of God. But if that's not your thing, that's okay. Maybe you've taken up baking bread. At least it looks like you all have from the empty aisles in the grocery stores. And maybe as you break bread, adding your yeast, you remember the story of the Exodus. Or maybe you think of Jesus saying that he is the bread of life. Or maybe you remember that time that Jesus was tempted in the desert to turn stones into loaves. And perhaps we can see Jesus not only in the breaking of the bread, but also in the baking of the bread. And if baking isn't your thing either, what about puzzles, woodworking, or scrapbooking, or reading? Maybe when we put together a puzzle, we remember how intricately God has woven this universe together, every piece fitting precisely, intentionally, and necessarily together. Or maybe as we turn a project on a lathe, investing ourselves in bringing something that we cannot see out of this chunk of wood, we remember how God has crafted us as a potter molds clay. Or maybe when we scrapbook and we lose ourselves in memories of our loved ones, we can resonate with Timothy, who was raised in his faith by his mother and grandmother. And we remember those who have raised us in the faith. And maybe as we read the books or comics or biographies, we remember stories from our own lives or the Bible that remind us of God. Or we see the sacrifice and heroism of others, and we remember the sacrifice and lengths that God has gone to demonstrate love to us. And these are just a few examples. And I'm sure I probably did not mention your new routine or your hobby. So take the time to think about the things you're doing in quarantine and what you can do to sanctify them. That is, to make them holy. Find ways to intentionally transform the new routines that you do have into moments for and with God. Learn how to create reminders of God's divine from the mundane things that we do, so that, like the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, we too can experience the joyful surprise of finding God in the unexpected rituals of quarantine. Somehow I think we can learn to tune our senses, to have eyes that see and ears to hear God in everything, all around us. As Paul says in Colossians, Christ is all and in all, if only we have the eyes and ears to see and hear it. So I pray that you all can have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. I pray that you find Christ in the breaking of the bread, and I pray that you find reminders of God in all the things that you're doing. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may God's face shine upon you and give you peace.